So my name's Justine Ball. I'm the Hampshire RE Inspector Advisor. I also advise on history. I'm also the RE Hub's South East lead, and I do that work on a Friday. And I was a Culham St Gabriel's Master's student, which is what I'll refer to in this talk. So that's me. Matt, would you like to go next, please?
Hi, I'm Matt Pitcher. I'm head of RE in Southampton, just taken up the post. I've been a head of RE in 4 other schools. I've just completed stage 2 or year 2 of the Culham St Gabriel's leadership programme, and I also sit on the NATRE Executive and the AREAIC Executive as well.
Thank you, Matt. Saima, please.
Hi everyone, my name's Saima. I am RE lead in a 5-form entry junior school in Surrey. I sit on the NATRE Exec as well as local groups officer. I have taken part in 2 years of the pilot scheme of the Culham St Gabriel's leadership programme, and I'm currently undertaking a Farmington, but you'll find out all about that later. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Saima. And Selena, please, welcome.
Thank you, Justine. Hi, everyone. I'm Selena Stone. I am a lecturer in Theology and Ethics at the University of Edinburgh, so not really linked directly with schools, but we'll be talking a little bit about my own experiences in the talk that I'll give soon. But great to be here with everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panellists for just giving that brief introduction. So we're going to go into about 10 minutes each on what we each think and use in research. So we'll go round the panelists, and then right at the end we'll have 10 minutes to ask questions, pose them in the chat as we go, share resources, share research. That would be really welcome. And I'm going to ask Selena, please, to start. Thanks, Selena.
Thanks, Justine. Yeah, it's really good to be here actually, and to think about worldviews and religious education in schools. I grew up in Birmingham, and so I now have just moved to Edinburgh, as in the last 6 weeks. But I am a Brummie through and through. And when I think about the beginnings of my interest in religion and worldviews, I think back to growing up in Birmingham, in Handsworth in particular, which is a very diverse part of the city. And I grew up in a very Christian family, but in a street with people from many different faiths and backgrounds. And so my childhood was a real wonderful mixture of exposure to many different people and their perspectives and their backgrounds. And the same street that I lived on would be the place we'd have Diwali festivals and Eid celebrations, and then at Christmas we'd have Christmas lights. So we kind of grew up in this context where, for me, learning about other people's ways of seeing the world, of seeing faith, was just baked into how I grew up. And then in my kind of professional life, I then started working as a community organizer after university, and that was when I really came face to face with the ways that understanding different people's perspectives can actually be really helpful in positively changing the world. And so community organizing really depends upon us being able to tell our own story honestly and authentically, and also listen to the perspectives of others and find those shared interests of common concern that we can work on together. And so I really felt that my background and my roots really equipped me well for that professional kind of work, because I'd kind of taken for granted that this is what lots of people experience, but actually meeting people from around the country, you realise that it's actually a real gift to grow up in the kind of place where you are learning about people that are different from you and understanding the different worldviews that people hold. And so I begin by talking about that because I think all of this has informed my life as a researcher. I actually began my PhD research because I was community organising in London, and we were really trying to get different faith groups, particularly church groups, involved, and to encourage them to think about community organising as part of their social responsibility. And so I was really interested in what was happening for those churches that didn't instinctively get involved, because for me the connections were quite clear between lots of the theologies, the different worldviews that I'll hear within Christian religious settings, and some of the urgent needs that we knew in inner city communities need to be addressed. And so I became really interested in how understanding theologies, the kind of perspectives that religious groups have, can actually shape, or whether they take part or not, within these kind of social engagement projects. And so that's what really got me into research in the beginning. And since then, I guess I've really been interested in continuing to think about how theology and understanding religion and worldviews, and I teach ethics as well, is really important for really building communities that work. I think we can take for granted that just by being together, we'll inevitably end up, learning about one another and appreciating those differences. But I think for me, the research that I've been doing in theology and religion and ethics, I think has really helped me to appreciate that taking the time to really think about those big questions can really enhance the quality of our life together. And that kind of thinking also, for me, isn't just a case of me sitting alone in a library, conjuring up ideas myself. A lot of theologians work in that way, and I do get why, because it's a lot simpler to kind of just do the work yourself. But I think for me, I'm really committed to doing that work with communities. And that means that the research that I do now and in the future comes out of the experiences and conversations that communities are having about the urgent questions that they're facing, whether that's about faith or whether that's just about life. So one of my most recent projects has been thinking about we've had some big stories recently about spiritual abuse in church settings. And I've really been thinking and writing a book actually on how the different perspectives, the different theologies that we can have within Christian communities can actually enable abusers. There's lots of ideas within religion, within Christian theology, that can be very powerful, empowering for people. And lots of people have taken up Christian ideas to fight against slavery, to kind of fight for women's rights, to fight for the rights of the poor. But at the same time, those ideas, other ideas, can be used in ways which oppress people and silence them and enable predators to kind of take advantage. And so I've been really thinking a lot about that in my own work. And this has really been stimulated by my own experiences of church settings, but also the stories of friends of mine, of peers, of people that I've worked with, people that I've just come across in my research life, in my community organizing life. And so for me, I'm become increasingly aware of the way that research has real power to really support individuals in their own lives and decision making and in their pursuit of spirituality and faith, which can be really important for lots of people, but at the same time can also open them up to people who want to take advantage. And so research for me has been really important in addressing some of the urgent questions that are being faced within Christian communities at the moment. And so I know that I'm quite unusual in that way. I think there are lots of theologians who don't really think about theology in these ways. There's a lot of discussion about quite abstract ideas that are quite important on some level. But I think the gift of theology and understanding religious perspectives and worldviews, and also non-religious worldviews, is that we get to identify what are the different factors that have led us to where we are, what are the different ways of thinking, the different almost invisible ideas. We don't talk about these ideas a lot sometimes, especially in a space like ours now, which is increasingly secular in some ways. Fewer and fewer people than ever now would identify as Christian, and yet we can't escape the way that Christianity has shaped so much of our life together, our ideas around culture, even our laws and all these kinds of elements of our life. And so even in the class that I teach now in Edinburgh, I'm teaching a course on public theologies, and this is really about the connections between Christian theology and some of the big public questions that we're experiencing. And I think people are so interested in understanding how are some of these ideas and assumptions continuing to have impact on what we think about big social justice issues, for example, even in a space where people are not, signing up to be Christian in the way that they used to. And so I think people are, in my class at least, my students are really understanding why it's important to think about theology and worldviews, and to think about religion, just to understand the context in which they're living, and to understand the history of what shaped the institutions that they're part of. And so that for me is really interesting. I'm somebody who takes quite obviously takes a critical approach to thinking about theologies and and a constructive approach, which means I'm both looking at what can go wrong with some of these ideas and also how might they be developed in ways that can really improve human flourishing, would say, for all people, and what does it mean to enable religious worldviews, theologies to actually be useful tools in constructing a better world. And so lots of the conversations that we're having is about that. Like, do we want, if religion is still important for lots of people, especially around the world, what resources do they provide for us to construct a better world for everyone? And so this is, for me, where the importance of religion research and worldviews is really there. It's in these big questions and thinking about how do we get the best from these traditions for people today, so that the world can be made a better place. That's how I think about it anyway. And so I think I'll probably stop there. I think I've talked enough, but thanks a lot, Justine.
Thank you very much, Selena, and that was brilliant timing as well. I just put up the 2-minute notice, so that was great. Thank you so much. I've got lots of questions, I think, and people will probably have the same just for you, Selena, but I'm going to save those and I'm going to encourage people, if you've got something, pop it in the chat and then we'll come to them all at the end. Thank you so much for that. Can I invite Matt, please, next?
Oh, thank you, Justine. So I'm going to look at research on worldviews in a more classroom-based mode and method. And we all have our biases when we select the research that we're going to use in the classroom. And when we read something, and I'm a big magpie, I like to read a lot and take the best bits and try and practice them in my classroom. So I'm going to kind of have a look at 3 things. What kind of research is going on at the moment and has just been completed? What do we use in my context, and how do we use it as well? So it's quite strange sitting in on Trevor's session yesterday and then a couple of the other seminars. I was thinking, wow, this is great, because this is kind of fits in exactly with what the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about. So we've seen over the last 10, 15 years this shift from the religion's paradigm to that kind of worldviews approach. And that's really been driven by the work of Trevor and Stephen Pett and the sample curricula that have been come out of the REC handbook over the last couple of years, which is really good to see that we're seeing worldviews seen in different contexts and different ways of teaching it. But I've also kind of looked at how it's kind of had an effect on my curriculum development, definitely going from a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to kind of adapting and changing, and also changing as I go along. So just 3 pieces of research that I've used this week in my teaching. So I teach majority year 7 and 8 at the moment, because to develop good RE. So we're looking at Sikhi in year 8 at the moment. So I've used James Holt's Understanding Sikhism book. Fantastic. I'm not doing a sales pitch here, but this is really great in terms of development for me and for the pupils. And we've got quite a large Sikh community within school and within Southampton as well. So it's really useful to use James's research and that of Jasjit's, who we heard yesterday, in developing my lessons to make them feel more alive, and not just from a textbook approach, but from more of a lived religion approach. Secondly, looking at the Nobody Stands Nowhere video that was produced a couple of years ago by the Theosts, and how we use that and how that sparks discussion about worldviews, certainly within our year 7s, where we're looking at the moment in terms of what is reality, what do we mean by a worldview? And that kind of ties into the next piece of research that I've used, which from like Andrew Wright et al., in terms of the critical religious education in practice. So all those 3 pieces of research have had a direct impact just in my teaching this week. So that's really useful for me. Hopefully it's useful for the pupils that I've got in my class and how that shapes it. But then looking at as well how the religious education handbook has kind of moved things on. That's the work of Gillian Giorgio, Jen Jenkins, and Nikki McGee, and how they've looked at their context. And what can I learn from that in terms of setting up my own curriculum and how I structure that, and looking at how, where they've gone and taking the ideas of that. And then I know that Trevor mentioned about hermeneutics yesterday as well. That's a really important part about interpretations and how we interpret different texts. As a teacher from a particular tradition and a particular kind of discipline, so I'm a sociologist and philosopher, that's my degree, and going into those religious texts and then unpacking them and then asking the pupils. So I had we're talking about the foundation of the Khalsa this week with my year 8s, and we were talking about within the tent what had actually happened. And some of my Sikh people said, well, we don't know it. I said, well, what was the blood? And they were like going, well, no one knows really. And then it sparked a really good discussion about how we know things. And one of the pupils was going, a non-Sikh people, well, it was such a long time ago. I said, well, it wasn't really. It was only 325 years ago. That's at the same time. That's after the Civil War in England. That's after Henry VIII. And we know so much about them. Why can't we know so much more about what the Sikhs do? And that led to such a more diverse and rich discussion than just plodding through the story and looking at it that way. And that was really, really good to see that we're seeing such a more diverse discussion. And as James Holt writes many times and spoken about it as well, about the messiness of religion and how it all kind of filters in. And I kind of thought yesterday about this in terms of a science example. So I like using analogies and metaphor in my lessons. So imagine you've got a big bit of filter paper and you take a chemical and you plop a blot down and it starts to spread across. So you've got the concentration in the middle and then it starts to spread out. And then in another part of the filter paper, you put another chemical and splodge, and how that filters out, and how when the two mix and change and affect each other. And then I was like, oh, actually, that's much like how some forms of Buddhism kind of spread across and interacted and developed and moved around. And it's just those uses of analogies and how things are that kind of messy. And then we look at the pupils' experience. So I always talked about, certainly to some of my Muslim pupils, well, which masjid do you go to within Southampton? How does that relate to other things that you might do? And why do you go to those masjid? And it's really important. We're not just treating those pupils, oh, you're Muslim, you believe this, and you do this, and then you do this, and then you do that. We're actually seeing a wide range of diversity within our pupils. So, and I might get shot down here, but I've heard it used before that I've probably been teaching about worldviews since I started teaching in the late 90s. It's far more explicit now. And we are, we go over the pedagogical methods of RE and how they've been used. So we look at Grimmett and we look at SMART and we look at Clive Erica. But when we talk about the lived experience, certainly within Hampshire, and we look at Clive's work in terms of the Hampshire Agreed Syllabus and how we place the pupil at the centre of our conceptual cycle, that is just exactly what worldviews can be like. That if we placing the pupil at the middle, they are looking at it from their personal worldview. And I know we had a lot of discussion over this weekend about what is personal knowledge. Well, personal knowledge comes from that pupil and placing it and reacting and interpreting what they see around them. And then we look at the blogs that people might produce, like Dawn Cox's blogs, and the use of symbolic language. I know she put out a tweet a couple of weeks ago about how one faith then integrates the language of another and those types of concepts. And that goes exactly how my Sikh pupils, when we're talking about AREAIC the other day. So there's such a wealth of research out there that we could we can use. And I've got to say thank you to Katie for putting up all the links into the chat. It's brilliant. Thank you. I had them all ready to pop in later. So one good thing that you might be able to use some of the NATRE resources in terms of the exploring different worldviews and the whosworldviews.com. I'll place that into there as well, if Katie doesn't beat me to it. Thank you.
Matt, brilliant. Thank you so much. Excellent timing on 9 minutes. That's great. Thank you for that. So, Saima, welcome.
Hello. So I think I'm going to touch on a few things that Matt spoke about, but something that I'd like to put across first of all is I am a primary school teacher, and I don't have unfortunately, I don't teach RE all day, every day. I really wish that I could. I've been teaching for 30 years, and that gives me my experience that not having a qualification in RE, which I always thought was going to be a hindrance, but it's not really. It's my lived experiences of having taught for so long and having taught RE all over the place, literally from Scotland all the way down to Surrey. So to be honest with you, I would say about 10 years ago, if someone had said to me, mention the word research, that would you take part in some research? Would you carry out some research? Would you use research in the, to be used in the classroom? I would probably have said no, because I don't have time. I would have, quite happily coasted along and all the rest of it. All of that happened until I think my journey with being part of NATRE and the NATRE Exec led me to being invited to carry out, be part of the leadership program on Culham St Gabriel's. And I've got to put a shout out to Katie, who's here. And Katie, thanks very much for putting all of the links in the chat. That is brilliant. And the lovely Jan Maguire, who was one of my mentors through that time. Having done my Culham experience and having had those 2 years, in the second year, I was asked to develop an area that I hadn't previously, that being carrying out some research. And to be honest with you, I was really out of my comfort zone with it. To begin with, I thought, what am I doing? Working full time and having a family, how can I fit it all in? And then along came COVID, and it was a blessing in disguise, really, because, thanks, Jen. COVID came along, and that gave me the opportunity to start reading. And that's where I would say my relationship with research began. I just bought loads of books. And, as you can remember, we couldn't go anywhere or do anything else. Life pretty much, the pause button was put on a lot of aspects of life. And I used that time to start reading. And my thirst for, I've always been an avid reader, but to do academic reading or to read anything relating to research or the classroom was, maybe sort of always on the back burner somewhere. So I used that time, and I realised that I absolutely loved what I was doing. My research that I carried out was based on etymology to enhance religious literacy in the classroom. And I did some class-based research where I used etymology in as many different ways as you can imagine: flashcards, activities, dancing, singing, all sorts of different things. And I carried out activities with mine. Then I had another class who just had a normal version of the lessons without all of my extras. And then I looked at the difference afterwards. Now, that was a while back. We're in 2024, and my school's just had Ofsted this week. So I'm still recovering from that lovely experience. And yes, my subject was deep dived. And one of the things that the Ofsted inspectors loved was the fact that in our school, some of the work from my research, in fact, quite a lot of the work that impacted my school from my research, was being recognised. The use of vocabulary, we have flashcards, we use etymology, we have etymology windows where we write on the windows in each classroom. The inspectors loved that. They said that they referred to the curriculum being like a rich tapestry, because we use a lot of really rich texts, our vocabulary use, and they loved our use of knowledge organisers. Now, they said in many schools that they'd been to before, they've seen teachers give children knowledge organisers that have been, made from other people or made by other people. But in our school, the children reflect on their learning and they put everything down on the knowledge organisers themselves. I did quite a bit of studying around dual coding, and that's one of the main reasons why I wanted children to make their own knowledge organisers and not just rely on words but pictures as well, and use any sort of way that they could to record their thinking that was going to be memorable for them. And it's really worked, because when I carry out monitoring in my school, it's always one of the things that the kids are really proud to show me. They'll always come up with the knowledge organisers. So that's a little bit about that. Moving on from my work on etymology, other things that I do, I read articles. I read as much as I can. I love the Impact magazine, so you get that if you're a member of Chartered College. I use blogs. I read books. A book that I have been reading, so I teach year 6, and we've just finished a topic around a unit on Buddhism, and during the tail end of the summer, I started reading a book by Karen Armstrong called The Buddha, and it's been absolutely brilliant, and it's been pivotal in helping me to enhance not only my learning but the learning of my pupils, to make their experience that little bit more authentic. I love listening to podcasts. Louisa Jane Smith, who I believe is at this conference, has a brilliant podcast set up. She's been running now for many, many years, and she has a particular podcast around Buddhism. I think it stems from a couple of years ago, actually. It's a bit of an old one, but it's a golden one as well. For the assessment lesson at the end of my Buddhist unit, I asked some of the children in my class to basically summarize their learning and try and put it into a podcast. Now, I've done this activity before, and every time I've used this before, the children's work's been all right, but it hasn't really, you don't get the same feeling as I got this year, and I'm going to tell you why that is. I played Louisa's RE podcast program. It was probably about 10 minutes. It wasn't the whole thing, because anyone who teaches in a primary school knows that children can't sit for that length of time. And I played them some of it, and just to give them an idea of what it could sound like and what they could put into their podcast. And I've got some children in my class with behavioural issues, and I've got some learners who find life a little bit tough, and they were the ones that said, Mrs. Sally, can we have the Easy Speaks, which are basically microphones that you can record on? And off they went into, I don't even know where they went. I think they went outside. We've got different learning spaces outside, outdoor learning spaces where they went. And they came back 20 minutes later, and part of me thought, I bet you they've just messed about and there's going to be nothing on this. So when they handed me the Easy Speak, I plugged it in, switched it on, and my oh my, was I blown away. The quality of their work was immense. So I thought, well, there you go. RE podcasts, they're not just for teachers, they're for children too. Not even for secondary school children, which is what I, would have thought right back beyond when I first started listening to them. But now I know that we can use them in the classroom and they can have a lot of high impact. And to finish off with, looking to the future, I'm currently, I've just started doing a Farmington. So I hope to look at the impact of using film as a genre in the classroom to teach about anti-racism, but through an RE lens. And I'm really excited about this, because I know what I've done before with the work that I did on etymology, and anti-racism is very close to my heart. And I love films, and I already run a film club that does just this. I just want to see now what the impact is, and start using the work that I've been doing for the past couple of years in this club to see if it can help teachers and pupils in the classroom. So all in all, that is basically it in a nutshell. It's my journey through research, how I use it, how I have used it, and where I hope it will take us all. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Saima. An excellent finish as well. That was a really good summary of everything that you talked about. So I'm going to finish off our presenting panel. And I liked Saima's ideas about my journey, Selena's ideas about her background, because I think that's where I'll start. I'll tell you about my background, where my focus has been in teaching. And then I'll talk to you about my research. And finally, I thought I'd end with, where do I go for research? And what do I do, particularly with the fact that I seem to spend a lot of time in the car, and I can be an hour and a half to a school each way. How do I use that time? Because increasingly, that's what I've been looking for, things like podcasts, things I can do in the car. So my journey, I started off like Selena, really. I was in an inner city Manchester, not Birmingham, but Manchester. I went to a Catholic convent school. My RE was, of course, Catholic Christianity, absolutely imbued with that. I found it fascinating. I loved it. I think I probably had the badge, the collector's badge, for the most pilgrimages. I seem to go on a Catholic pilgrimage every year. So when I look back, I think that was really interesting for me, and it probably developed a lifelong interest in religion in its different forms. I then went into adult education for many years after my degree. My degree was theology. And interestingly, I will share it because it does resonate maybe with some of you here about how do we all access research. I went to Oxford. So Oxford was very driven by, you don't do anything in terms of continual study until you get to the last 4 weeks of the third year, and then you do your 9 3-hour exams, and that's it. So I never learned the Harvard referencing. I never learned that. But I did nevertheless manage to cram for exams. I was really good on that, still good at it. I think it gives you a lifelong feel for how you prepare for something really quickly. But it didn't have that Harvard referencing that actually I know puts teachers off and makes you think, that isn't for me. How on earth do you access it? So many years went by. I retrained, and like Saima, I was a primary teacher, which I absolutely loved. And I left that to become the Hampshire advisor. A couple of years in, I thought, actually, I need to go back and study again. I can't just rely on what I did when I was 18 to 21. I'm going to have to relearn and rethink things, because the world of religion and worldviews has moved on so much. While I always give credit to researchers who've gone before, years, decades before, I did in my last workshop with people, the thinking has moved and we need to keep up to date. And so I felt, yeah, I'm going to have to do a master's at some point. But like many teachers, I didn't feel ready to do that, not least because of this Harvard referencing issue. And how on earth do you quote from books? Because I just speak about books. That's how I learned. So a shout out to something that I don't think I've heard mentioned yet. I did a lot of modules with the Wolf Institute. The Wolf Institute has got some great modules on, here's a short module that you study about Abrahamic religions. It's mainly Abrahamic religions, the interplay between religions, which is great because it's not just a religion on its own, but the interplay, the interaction over the years. So I began with those, and I learned through one question, one answer, how do you do the Harvard referencing business, whatever it's called in that institution. So Wolf, big shout out. They still do lots of courses, lots of things, summer schools. They do a newsletter. I am very grateful for them for providing a step in. Through Column is my next shout out, because I know that's been mentioned many times by others, but they funded a large part of my master's. My master's was on religious studies with the wonderful Wendy Dossett at Chester University. And there I did finally learn how to do the academic referencing and not to just talk about it, which is my background. So if I hadn't have done the Wolf, if I hadn't have engaged with little modules on Column, I don't think I could have made that big step. So my shout to teachers here today is, you know, there are things that will help you along your way. There are little bite-sized modules. Cullen does a lot of those. RE Hubs that I do work for on a Friday, they've got a lot of pods there that will help people just get into research. RE Online's another good one because it summarises research. And it also has video clips, which is absolutely brilliant if you're on the move. So something that's affected me, I'm just going to share one example, and I think I've got till 12:13. I did my dissertation, my 22,000 words, on decolonising the teaching of Jesus in RE in English primary schools. I couldn't have got to that point without all the other little stages on the way. And I'm just going to shout out to some of the research that I found so important then. I still do now. I still sometimes wake up thinking about it because I think that is such a good point. I've got to go and tell that to teachers, pass it on, because it really resonates with me. So what did I look at? Well, we talked a lot actually on the conference about religion and worldviews. I looked back to an early presentation by Trevor Cooling, 2020, he did this. And he talked about the principles of a worldviews approach. I would agree with Matt. I'd think, yeah, I was doing that anyway. But actually, how good to have it articulated and to make me think about that. So I really started to think about the 6 world religions paradigm that people talk about, researchers talk about, and the focus on classifying and mastery and head knowledge. And I didn't want that. What I wanted was what I think Matt referred to, that fuzzy edges, the edges where religions interact with each other, are affected by their context, like Selina was saying, and that they're fluid, that the diversity really matters, the context really matters. Are we doing that in RE? That's what I keep asking myself. So I really looked for things like what was continuous, what had changed, what changed over time, what was the context, and of course, was so interested about the research on decolonisation. I was going to give one shout out to decolonisation, which is a huge topic. There are so many people writing brilliant things about them. Liam Gearan has a good article on RE and decolonising. I thought that was a great article, made me really think about it. The work of Felix as well, he talks about decolonising, and it just poses more questions, of course, than answers, but it really makes you think. Another shout out was RE and anti-racist research. Now, when I was doing my master's, Saima's mentioned this, I didn't find many articles on RE and anti-racism. I think that's improved. But as in my earlier workshop, I do shout out to Wendy Ridley with a Spanner in the Works book, because it was when I was reading that book about generally the curriculum that I thought, what exactly am I advising on anti-racism and RE? And I still keep coming back to that because it's so hugely important. And something John Hull said, I mean, this is going back quite a few years, but I love his research. I love his work. It still makes me think. He said the displays, the books, the day-to-day lives, what is not talked about in RE is as important as what is talked about. So it's made me think, who am I not talking about and how do I include that? And then finally, got 2 minutes, I know, teaching about Christianity, all those Bryn surveys, they're really interesting for the diversity within Christianity in England. And I think it's just England, correct me somebody if I'm wrong on that. The diversity in Christian denominations. Selina talked about that actually within one religion, there's huge diversity. We shouldn't be afraid of that. I've seen teachers teach that really well from EYFS onward. Layla, who's on this call, I think does that really, really well. So finally, teaching about Jesus, I really liked the research of Rob Freethy, Karen Walsh, Terence Copley. I know Rob Freethy's here today to talk about his. I loved his questions about what do we teach about Jesus in other religions? Do we involve children in the class who are from different traditions, but nevertheless might have really good views and interest in Jesus. And so we could replicate that across religions. So for me, it's changed the way I think, really, research. It's made me pose the questions Selena asked at the beginning about what happens when it goes wrong? What about the views of religion that are so tight and constrained that it might lead to abuse? It might need to narrower thinking. So it's opened up windows that weren't there when I finished my degree. And in my last 1.5 minutes, I was thinking for people, what is really useful? I get asked all the time, will you do a podcast? So I think podcasts are really important. We've got Louisa's podcast. The links are in the chat there. I was contrasting it with history, where every time I get in the car for my 1.5 hour drive, I stick something on. The Ancients, Greg Jenner, You're Dead to Me, all of those, they're brilliant. But we need more of a variety in RE. So if all of us could do a podcast on early years, anti-racist principles, Selena's research, it would be so good for teachers, because the one thing teachers always say to me is, I haven't got any time. I don't have time. I get that. I don't have much either, but something you can listen to, really important. So big shout out for podcasts, even if we think we can't do one. Is that imposter syndrome? Could we do one? I think we could, including myself here on that. Another one I found, podcast-wise, Melvin Bragg, strange one there, In Our Time. He does actually touch on religion. You might agree, you might disagree, but you could put it on in your car, you could put it on while you're making dinner. It's another podcast to make us think. Like Saima, I liked Cameron Armstrong. I didn't agree with all the approaches, but that made me think. The Charter College, the Impact magazine, that was really helpful for my earlier workshop. Other areas, the research pod of RE Hubs. There's loads on there. If you've got something you use, then I think that's really good to shout to us. We'll put it on there. 2 things to finish with. The first one is to say to teachers, all of us do research. We do research all the time in the classrooms. Advisors do research with teachers. So sometimes we might be thinking, I can't do that like I did because I haven't got the Harvard referencing. We can do that. There is help out there. We can do that. But tell us about that small research you do in your classrooms. That is so interesting. And on a final plea, hear children. Listen to them on RE. They are research as well. What is it they've loved? What is it they've not liked? And what is it they frankly reject? So I'll probably end with one little boy who I was bringing all my research into the teaching about Jesus. And he said to me in year 4, Mrs. Ball, it doesn't matter what you say to me about sharing my food on the Sermon on the Mount. I'm keeping my food. Food's really important to me, and I'm not sharing it with anyone. So that was great feedback for me, because it made me think, okay, then we might need to do just a little bit of work here unpinning what this is all about and how it might relate to RE and some of the examples shown. So I'm going to stop there, because we should have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So I haven't seen the chat, but I'll pause now and we'll have a look at what's in the chat. Saima, did you see if there was anything in the chat we can start with?
There's a lot of love in the chat. I haven't spotted any questions. Oh, there we go. I think people are just asking for links. Jen has asked, please could you share the survey you mentioned about religious diversity in the UK?
Yeah, I will do. So just answering that while people are typing away, it was the Bryn survey. If you put that into a search engine, I think his name is Alan Bryn. Bill might know. And it's about, he does it every year, and it's really interesting for the demographics of Christian communities and the differences on how you can obviously use that in your teaching.
Shabnam's asked, Justine, can you share the links in decolonisation?
Yes, I will. I'm going to ask Selena a question while I think of those links, because I asked you a question earlier, Selena. I don't know if you saw it, about where do you start with talking about theology and how it might have negatively impacted people in terms of abuse. Could you give an example of where you might start with that, please?
I mean, there were just so many examples, unfortunately. Yeah. I mean, the way into it, and it depends a lot on the kind of theology you're teaching, or the kind of topic you're having a conversation about. So in my public theologies course, there's like ample examples. You just have to look to Christian colonial history to figure that out. And so you can go all the way back to like 16th century, the encyclicals from the Pope around the doctrines of discovery, around going into the New World, and it being seen as empty because Christians weren't there, and giving permission to kind of killing, taking land, and enslaving people. That's the kind of where I begin for me historically in terms of abuse and power and oppression in Christian theologies. But I think when you can go right up to thinking about the place of gender and the way that biblical texts have been weaponized against women in churches, the way that theologies have been developed to argue for the multiple, the kind of polygenesis theories, the idea that there are a range of different kinds of human people that exist, the kind of basis of the kind of scientific racism, the way that biblical texts were used and the creation narratives were used to argue that there was a kind of superior race made by God, who were obviously the white people, and a kind of secondary race that were then everybody else. So there's kind of ample ways into thinking about the ways that theology has been used in these ways, depending on the subject that you're thinking about.
Thank you, Selena. Yeah, thank you. I didn't catch much else on the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to ask us anything.
Sorry, I just realised I didn't put myself on pause as I coughed. I have this everlasting cough. I don't see any other questions, but if anyone does have a question, I guess you could take yourself off mute and just ask. But mine is a bit of a practical one that I'm thinking about. So I named a few of the things that I do, but does anybody who's here have any brilliant ways of engaging the teachers with research in your schools who really don't want to know it? They don't want it. They don't want any extra work. They don't want to engage in it. They're really not interested at all. Has anyone got any good ways of engaging those sorts of teachers who say, I haven't got time, sorry, not interested? Louisa, would you like to talk about your engaging your TAs? Because that's a really interesting one.
Yeah, very happy to. Let me just put my video on. So I'm taking all of this in. Thanks so much, it's been brilliant. In the previous role as a Senko, what I realised was that TAs were missing out. They weren't getting the opportunity to have an article of the week, any research. So I just made it commonplace to say, this is your folder, this is the offer, sometimes applicable to the day-to-day of what they were doing, sometimes a bit further afield and overarching. But that was so useful. They also felt valued. They felt that they were part and parcel of this research community. So that was, really useful. But it's been brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. And so nice not to have slides, but to really, really listen and engage. Thanks so much.
I was going to mention that RE Online do some really good synopsis of different parts of research. And their research for the month is really useful as well. So even if you're asking people to access those kind of things, that if you can get a synopsis, someone would far prefer to read a summary on one sheet of paper than 8 or 9 sides in their own time. And my dog is trying to break into my room. Moment.
I was just going to say that I did my fountain back in 2003. Prior to that, my head of department just put the leaflet on my desk every year, and that happened for about 5 years. And then one day I just picked it up and thought, do you know what? I think I'm going to go for this. And I think I know it just might mean, he says it was, you know, at the time when I, you know, sort of before I was head of department, he sort of said it was the worst thing that he ever did in terms of letting me out of school for a whole term. But it was a fantastic experience, and it really sort of led that hunger for research, I think, within my own teaching profession, and it gave me time to research something that I'd never actually sort of researched, taught myself. So doing that and making resources for other teachers was such a fantastic opportunity. This conference has actually reminded me a lot of being part of that, and I look back with that, but very fondly on that time. But I think it's just sort of like encouraging people to do it, you know, and by putting that leaflet on somebody's desk, you're saying you're capable of doing this, have a go.
Thank you, Heather. Do you know what? That's really good you've mentioned Farmington, because when I was trying to think, I knew there was some more that you always miss off when you're trying to summarise what is out there. So thank you so much for that. There were two really good questions in the chat, if I might go back to them. One was asking, one of my favourites, I struggle with research due to dyslexia and ADHD. Any tips? Now, I know people who know me well, I often have conversations about ADHD and learning. It is in my family. We've had to engage with that a lot. Any top tips from any of us? I've got a few to think about there as well and to share. And somebody else Elaine was asking about podcasts. I'll start with the podcast if I can. Actually, the most useful thing somebody said to me is, Justine, don't do an hour on a podcast. No one's going to listen. And I thought, right, yeah, that is a good point, because we haven't got the time. So shorter is better. Can you do 10 minutes? Lots of 10 minutes, not just an hour. Something else I see in the history world when I'm advising there is that people might put one whole recording of 3 hours on YouTube of a really interesting conversation. But if only somebody had chunked it up into 5-minute segments. This bit is on dyslexia. This bit is on making a podcast. I would find that so useful. I'm sure others would too. So I suppose the message to podcasts, Elaine, is less is more. That's what I've learned anyway. The other question, we're on to immersive reader. Bill, I'll leave you to go into the chat on that one. The ADHD question is so interesting because it's how do we all learn? I can't sit for hours online. I start to get really fidgety. That's no surprise. There's that, you know, we all do. So I guess chunking it up is quite good. And I think Matt mentioned earlier the summaries of research are good. When you go on the RE Online website, I'm sure it's that one, there are people who do a 5-minute presentation on their research. Watch that. You know, that's a good way in. Listen to somebody. Give yourself 5 minutes at a time rather than, I'm going to do 3 hours on this question. I think that might help us all. I'm sure there might be more.
I was going to say, Justine, that during the COVID times, the period when RE Online and a lot of other establishments did their in conversations with. So if you can even go to Chester or Edge Hill, they all have a collection of the materials that they put out during those times. So they've got a whole library of researchers talking to Catherine and to Fiona in conversations. Go back and have a look at those, because they are a really good way of gateway into those parts of research. So yeah, sorry, my dog is everybody's gone out.
That's quite all right. I love this idea of the immersive reader. I think that could be really helpful, like that. Somebody said it earlier as well about, oh, it's good there's no PowerPoint. Well, actually, yeah, I don't always like PowerPoint. As you know, I had a real fight with my PowerPoint in my earlier workshop. Sometimes it's just easier, isn't it, to not have PowerPoint and to let your mind wander and drift. I find learning on the go easier than sitting down and doing it. My son does. He memorably once learned for his GCSEs doing rock climbing, took a book with him and went up and learned. And actually, he remembered loads doing that. So I think PowerPoints, that's an interesting area as well. Less is more. Lastly, we've probably just got time for Sarah's question because 4 minutes left, that's fine. How do people select what to read? Really good question. Any offers on that, panelists?
Well, I normally go with whatever I'm teaching at the time and what can help me most with it. Or if I'm looking for new pedagogies or ways of getting to children that other things aren't, so effective with, I will then start researching, and anything that takes my fancy. I love reading, and I just struggle to find the time. So I really like Katie's idea of putting text into an immersive reader. I think I'm going to start doing that from now on. Thanks very much, Katie.
Yeah, the immersive reader is also on Adobe as well. So there's a little icon if you click on the PDF and it will read it to you. And as someone says, you can select the voice. So if you want someone who sounds a bit like Robbie Williams speaking to you, or Fiona Bruce, that's fine. I was going to pick up on Shabnam's question about how do you convince SLT? And I'm going through this at the moment with some musings about Farmington. Sell it to them. This is what I can do for the school. How can I link it into some of the school's development priorities? So I'm looking at terms of how we can use RE and adaptive teaching, and certainly with our SEN pupils, because there's nothing, absolutely nothing out there at the moment on SEN and RE, and it's a bit of a desert. So create your research, become the researcher and get picked up on it. Because if you can do something for the school, that is so much of the benefit. And then you can apply it to other areas of the school as well. And it gets you a bit of kudos as well.
Folks, we're nearly at the end. I'm just looking on the chat, see if there's anything there. Big shout out for Farmington, I reckon. I didn't know you could select a voice. That's brilliant. And Louisa, thank you so much for the Augustine quote. I think that I really echo that. I love walking and thinking. I think that's great. Really powerful.
You can also listen to a podcast while you walk.
You can indeed. Yep, I do that a lot as well, Heather. Yep. I just think we need more podcasts, don't we, in RE? Yeah, absolutely. I think we've come to the end of our time. We have 1 minute. Is there anything burning from anybody?
Just to say thank you. It's been really good.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. And thank you for a Saturday morning, too. It's been so worth it. Thank you all for being here. And thank you particularly my panelists, Selena, Matt, Saima. Thank you so much. It's always better to do this with other people. I think I've really gone away with lots to think about from today. Thank you, folks.